Islamabad protests: Pakistan won't use force to clear Islamists. The Pakistani government and military have decided not to use force against Islamist protesters blocking a highway in Islamabad. The government had asked the military to restore order after police failed to disperse protesters on Saturday. But Prime Minister Shahid Khaqan Abbasi and Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa decided on Sunday to restart negotiations with Islamist leaders to resolve the standoff. The protests have gone on for weeks. Demonstrators have been blocking the Faizabad interchange, demanding the sacking of Law Minister Zahid Hamid. Their protests have spread to other cities, including Lahore and the southern port of Karachi. At least 6 people are believed to have been killed in the clashes on Saturday. About 200 were injured. There were more clashes in Islamabad on Sunday. Reports say that the government has called in a paramilitary force known as the Rangers to control the protests. On Saturday, the government suspended private news channels and blocked certain social networks, including Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, out of concern that live coverage of the police action could inflame religious sentiments. Local media said they remain blocked on Sunday. Growing tensions, online and off. The situation in Islamabad had been simmering for 3 weeks before it erupted into violence on Saturday. Many blamed the government for their delay in acting, which allowed the protesters to grow in numbers and build a countrywide momentum for their movement. And when they moved, the authorities did not appear to have a good plan. The police failed to arrest leaders of the protest, and when trouble started to spill into other cities, they resorted to a controversial move to block all live news channels and social media websites. Now the military has stepped in. On Saturday, its chief spokesman tweeted to say the army chief had told Prime Minister Shahid Khaqan Abbasi that the protester issue should be resolved by avoiding violence from both sides. This has raised many eyebrows. An editorial in Dawn newspaper on Sunday morning said it had oddly equated the government with the protesters. Others have raised concerns over the timing of this tweet, saying it would embolden the protesters. The politics behind the protests. About 8,500 elite police and paramilitary forces took part in Saturday's operation to clear the Faizabad interchange. The operation was later suspended. The request for the military deployment came after hundreds more demonstrators turned up unexpectedly, forcing the police to retreat. The protesting Islamists, from the hardline Tehreek-i-Labbaik-e-Rasool-Allah party, want the law minister to be sacked for omitting a reference to the Prophet Muhammad in a new version of the electoral oath. The minister has since apologized, saying it was a clerical error. Pakistan protests, the political tensions behind the scenes. The situation in Islamabad had been simmering for 3 weeks before it erupted into violence on Saturday. Many blame the government for allowing the protesters to grow in number and build a countrywide momentum for their movement. When the authorities moved, they did not appear to have a good plan. The police failed to arrest leaders of the protest, and when trouble started to spill into other cities, they resorted to a controversial policy of blocking all live news channels and social media websites. But the situation is not unprecedented in a country where the constitutionally elected civilian authority has found the rug being pulled from under its feet every 2 to 4 years. Corruption scandals have been invariably used to topple governments through courts, and there are instances when religious hordes have stormed urban centers to undermine the legitimacy of such governments. Many suspect that these moves come with the tacit support of the military, though the military denies this. Saturday's action against the protesters came under similar circumstances. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was ousted by the Supreme Court in a controversial corruption ruling in July. His parliamentary support was expected to diminish as a result, but that did not happen, sparking speculation that he may re-emerge as a victor in next year's elections. Since Mr. Sharif's party, PMLN, has considerable standing with right-wing religious voters in Punjab province, many believe the protest by the ultra-right-wing Tehreek-i-Labbaik-e-Rasool-Allah, TLIRA, is aimed at attracting some of that support towards itself. The military stepped in on Saturday when its chief spokesman tweeted to say the army chief had told the new Prime Minister, Shahid Khakan Abbasi, that the issue of protesters should be resolved by avoiding violence from both sides. This has raised many eyebrows. Dawn newspaper in an editorial comment said it had oddly equated the government with the protesters. Others have raised concerns over the timing of this tweet, saying it would embolden the protesters. Hours after the tweet, the government enlisted the army's support in aid of civil administration. But security experts were of the view that the military may only secure state buildings and installations against possible attacks, and that regular army troops were unlikely to physically confront the protesters. There has been a sense that the government was predicting such a scenario, hence its initial reluctance to move against the protesters. But its hand was forced by the top judiciary. Islamabad High Court declared the highway sit-in illegal 2 weeks ago, and last week it issued contempt notices to top administration officials for failing to clear the protesters. Later the Supreme Court also initiated hearings in the case, asking the government to restore the people's right to freedom of movement in occupied areas. Initially, the media coverage of the protest was minimal due to small numbers of the protesters and also because roadblocks by obscure religious groups trying to register their presence has become a routine affair in Pakistani politics. But Saturday's escalating events change this. If the sit-in continues, it will bring more pressure to bear both on the government and the military. Just how the situation pans out is hard to predict. Aside from the blocking of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and other social media websites, television channels remain off air and their live streaming pages have been suspended. Meanwhile, schools have been ordered closed for 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, in the province of Punjab, which is home to more than 50% of the country's population. It is also the PMLN party's home base, and where the political future of Nawaz Sharif will be decided in next year's elections.